There comes a moment in every man's life when the past catches up with those who've wronged him, not with violence, but with quiet truth. In the dusty boom town of Red Bluff, 1886, that moment arrived when Silas Boone, a weathered mountain man, walked into a saloon and faced the railroad tycoon who had destroyed his father. Bartholomew Kane, drunk on wealth and arrogance, saw only an easy mark. He wagered $10,000 that Silas couldn't open his new safe from back east. The crowd laughed and jeered, but in 60 seconds the laughter died. The safe opened, revealing gold and secrets Kane never wanted exposed. What no one knew was that Silas's father had built that very safe before Kane betrayed him. Yet Silas walked away from the money. Why would a man refuse $10,000 after such a victory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning. Sun had barely cleared the eastern peaks when Silas Boone guided his pack mule down the rocky trail into Red Bluff. 3 months in the high country had left him lean and weathered, his beard grown thick and streaked with gray, his hands calloused from trapping and skinning. The mule carried a season's worth of beaver and marten pelts, enough to resupply and see him through another winter if the prices held fair. Red Bluff had changed since his last visit 2 years prior. The town sprawled wider now, spreading like spilled water across the valley floor. New buildings lined the main street, false-fronted establishments with fresh paint and glass windows that caught the morning light. The railroad had arrived, and with it came the kind of prosperity that transformed quiet settlements into boom towns practically overnight. Silas could hear the rhythmic clang of hammers on steel even from the outskirts, the sound of expansion and ambition echoing off the surrounding hills. He remembered Red Bluff as a modest trading post with a general store, a blacksmith, and maybe 24 residents who valued their peace. Now the street teemed with activity. Freight wagons rumbled past, loaded with timber and supplies. Men in suits walked alongside miners still dusty from their claims. The smell of fresh-cut lumber mixed with coal smoke and horse manure, the perfume of progress that settlers called it. Though Silas found it harsh compared to pine and mountain air, at the edge of town he passed a cluster of workers' tents and shanties where railroad laborers lived. Chinese men hunched over cook fires, while Irish crews gathered near a whiskey barrel, already drinking, though the day had just begun. The railroad brought work, but it brought hunger too. Hunger for land, for wealth, for dominance. Silas had seen it before in other towns. The pattern never changed. He guided his mule toward the general store, a sturdy building that had survived Red Bluff's transformation. The sign above the door read, "Drummond's Mercantile," in faded letters, and Silas felt a small measure of relief. Sarah Drummond had run this store for 20 years, one of the few constants in a world that seemed determined to erase its own history. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Inside, the store smelled of coffee, dried herbs, and lamp oil. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from canned goods to fabric, tools to tobacco. Behind the counter stood Sarah Drummond herself, a woman in her late 50s with silver hair, pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that missed nothing. She looked up from her ledger, and her face softened with recognition. "Silas Boone, I wondered if you'd survive another winter up there." "Morning, Sarah." He removed his hat, suddenly conscious of how wild he must look. "Came to trade if you're still buying. Always buying from honest trappers." She came around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gaze was direct, assessing him with the kind of familiarity that came from long acquaintance. "You look tired, Silas. Thinner than last time. Winter was hard. Lost some traps to a bear. Had to range farther for good catches." Sarah nodded, understanding the lean times without needing details. "Let me see what you've brought." They conducted business in the comfortable silence of people who'd known each other for years. Sarah had been a friend to his family once, back when the Boones had lived in Red Bluff. That was before everything fell apart, before his father's name became synonymous with failure and disgrace. Sarah had been one of the few who hadn't turned away, who'd offered kindness when kindness was scarce. She examined each pelt with practiced hands, noting quality and condition. "Fine work, Silas. Your father would be proud. You've got his touch." The mention of his father brought a familiar ache, dull now after so many years, but never fully gone. Thomas Boone had been a master locksmith, a craftsman whose skill with tumblers and mechanisms was renowned throughout the territory. He taught Silas everything: how to listen to a lock, how to feel the subtle resistance of pins, how to understand that every lock was a puzzle waiting to be solved, with patience and respect. "Thank you," Silas said quietly. "He was a good teacher." Sarah's expression grew somber. "He was a good man. What happened to him wasn't right, Silas. Wasn't right at all." Before Silas could respond, the door banged open and a young man rushed in, breathless with excitement. "Miss Sarah, you should see what's happening at the Silver Horn." Kane's showing off his new safe, taking bets on whether anyone can crack it. "Says it's impossible, came all the way from Philadelphia." Sarah's face tightened at the mention of Kane. She glanced at Silas, concern flickering in her eyes. "Who's Kane?" Silas asked, though something in the way Sarah reacted made his chest tighten. The young man answered before Sarah could. "Bartholomew Kane. He owns the railroad, half the businesses in town, and most of the land for 10 miles around. Richest man in the territory, they say. Smart as a whip, too. He's offering $10,000 to anyone who can open his new safe. $10,000. A fortune that could set a man up for life." But Silas felt no temptation, only a growing unease. Sarah dismissed the young man with a wave. "Go on, Daniel. Tell your mother. I'll have those supplies ready by afternoon." When the door closed, Sarah turned to Silas with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Silas, there's something you should know about Bartholomew Kane." "I'm listening." She moved to the window, looking out at the street where more people were heading toward the saloon, drawn by the spectacle. "Kane came to Red Bluff about 15 years ago. He was nobody then, just another Eastern man with ambition. He partnered with a local craftsman, someone who had skills Kane needed. Together they were going to build an empire, Kane's business sense and your father's genius, with locks and safes." Silas's hands clenched. He'd known his father had a partner once before the fall. Thomas had never spoken the name, the shame too deep. "Kane stole your father's designs," Sarah continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Took credit for the work, filed patents in his own name, and when Thomas objected, Kane destroyed him. Spread lies, ruined his reputation, made sure no one would hire him or believe him. Your father tried to fight it, but Kane had money and lawyers. Thomas had nothing but the truth, and in this world, that's rarely enough." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through memories Silas had tried to bury. He remembered his father's decline, the drinking, the despair, the way Thomas would sit for hours, staring at his tools, but unable to work. He remembered his mother's death from heartbreak and exhaustion, trying to hold the family together while Thomas fell apart. He remembered being 14 years old and finding his father's body, a half-empty bottle beside him, and a note that said simply, "I'm sorry." "Why are you telling me this now?" Silas asked, his voice rough. "Because that safe Kane is showing off. I've seen it, Silas. I watched them unload it yesterday. It has your father's mark on it, the signature work Thomas always did. Kane commissioned it from the Philadelphia company that stole Thomas's designs. He's parading around your father's genius as if it's his own." Silas felt something shift inside him, a weight he'd carried for 20 years suddenly becoming unbearable. He'd spent 2 decades in the mountains, running from the past, from the pain, from the anger that threatened to consume him if he let it. He'd become a ghost, a shadow moving through the high country, avoiding towns and people and anything that might remind him of what he'd lost. But here, in this moment, the past had found him anyway. "I should go," he said. "Finish my business and head back up the mountain." Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "Or you could stay. Face what needs facing. Your father never got justice, Silas. Kane built his empire on Thomas Boone's back, and everyone's forgotten. Maybe it's time someone remembered. Through the window, Silas could see more people streaming toward the Silver Horn Saloon, drawn by the promise of entertainment and the impossible challenge. Somewhere in that crowd was Bartholomew Kane, the man who destroyed his father and stolen his legacy. Silas picked up his hat, running his fingers along the worn brim. His father's tools were in his saddlebag, carried all these years as a reminder of who Thomas Boone had been before the fall. He'd never used them, couldn't bear to, but he'd never let them go either. $10,000, he said softly. What kind of man wages that much on a lock? The kind who's never met a lock he respected, Sarah replied. The kind who thinks money makes him untouchable. Silas looked at her, seeing both the warning and the encouragement in her eyes. She wasn't pushing him toward revenge, but she was opening a door, showing him a path he'd avoided for 2 decades. He thought about his father's hands, strong and sure, guiding his own smaller fingers across the smooth surface of a lock. Listen, boy, Thomas would say. Every lock tells a story. You just have to be patient enough to hear it. Where's this saloon? Silas asked. The Silver Horn Saloon stood at the center of Red Bluff's main street, a 2-story establishment with gilt-edged windows and a balcony where Kane's associates often gathered to survey their domain. Piano music drifted through the bat-wing doors, accompanied by the rumble of male voices and occasional bursts of laughter. Silas paused outside, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. He could turn around, collect his supplies, mount his mule, and disappear back into the mountains where the past couldn't touch him. That had been his strategy for 20 years, and it had kept him alive, kept him sane. But Sarah's words echoed in his mind, and beneath them, deeper still, he heard his father's voice teaching him about locks and patience and the stories things told if you listened carefully enough. Silas pushed through the doors. The saloon was packed. Bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder around a central clearing where a massive iron safe stood like a monument to industrial progress. The safe was nearly 5 feet tall, black metal decorated with brass fittings and an ornate dial that caught the lamplight. Men crowded around it, examining the craftsmanship, discussing its features with the enthusiasm of those who understood. They were witnessing something remarkable. At the center of attention stood Bartholomew Kane. He was a large man, not from physical labor but from comfortable living. His suit was tailored, his boots polished, his beard trimmed to fashionable specifications. Gold watch chains draped across his vest, and rings adorned 3 of his fingers. He held a glass of whiskey in one hand and gestured grandly with the other, playing to his audience like an actor on stage. "Gentlemen," Kane announced, his voice carrying easily over the noise, "this safe represents the pinnacle of modern security technology. Forged in Philadelphia by the finest craftsmen in America, it features a revolutionary locking mechanism that is, quite simply, unbreakable. I've had it tested by experts from Chicago to San Francisco. Not one could crack it," the crowd murmured appreciatively. Kane basked in their attention, then raised his glass. "Which is why I'm prepared to wager $10,000 to anyone who can open it. $10,000, gentlemen. A fortune for any man brave enough or foolish enough to try." Laughter rippled through the saloon. Several men called out suggestions, mostly jokes about dynamite or sledgehammers. Kane laughed along with them, secure in his superiority. Silas remained near the door, studying the safe from a distance. Even from 30 feet away, he could see his father's influence in the design. The placement of the dial, the reinforcement patterns on the door, the way the hinges were concealed. These were Thomas Boone's signatures. The small innovations that had made his safes both beautiful and functional. Kane had stolen more than designs. He'd stolen artistry. "What about you, friend?" Silas looked up to find Kane staring directly at him, a predatory smile on his face. The saloon grew quieter as attention shifted. "You look like a man who's worked with his hands," Kane continued, his tone mocking. "Perhaps you'd like to try your luck, or are you just here to gawk with the rest of the yokels?" The insult was deliberate, designed to establish dominance. Silas recognized the tactic. Make the target feel small, insignificant beneath notice. It was the same approach Kane had likely used on Thomas, dismissing his concerns, minimizing his contributions until nothing remained but shame. Silas stepped forward. The crowd parted, creating a path to the safe. He walked slowly, taking in details as he approached. The safe wasn't just locked. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down by a man who believed himself untouchable. "I'll try," Silas said quietly. Kane's smile widened. "Excellent! We have a volunteer. And what's your name, mountain man?" "Silas Boone." For just a moment, so brief most wouldn't notice, something flickered in Kane's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. But then the smile returned, even broader than before. "Boone," Kane repeated, as if tasting the name. "Any relation to Thomas Boone, the old drunk who used to pretend he was a locksmith?" The saloon erupted in laughter. Silas felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice steady. "Thomas Boone was my father, and he was the finest locksmith in the territory." Kane's expression shifted to mock sympathy. "Ah, yes, I remember now. Poor Thomas. Had potential once, but couldn't handle the competition. Took to the bottle, as I recall. Tragic story, really. My condolences on your loss, though. I believe that was, what? 15, 20 years ago?" 20 years, Silas confirmed. "Almost to the day. Well then," Kane gestured to the safe with exaggerated courtesy. "Perhaps you inherited some of your father's talent. Though I should warn you, this safe is considerably more sophisticated than anything Thomas ever worked on. He was more of a, how shall I put it? A tinkerer. This is precision engineering." More laughter from the crowd. Silas ignored it, focusing on the safe. He set down his pack and knelt before the black iron face. Up close, he could see the quality of the workmanship, the attention to detail that his father had championed. The dial was smooth under his fingertips, the metal cool and solid. "The terms," Kane announced to the crowd. "If this gentleman can open the safe in, let's say, 2 minutes, I'll pay him $10,000 in gold. But if he fails, he cleans my stables for a month. Do we have an agreement, Mr. Boone?" Silas didn't look up. "Agreed. Excellent. Someone time this." Kane pulled out his gold watch. "Beginning now." Silas closed his eyes and pressed his ear against the safe door. The saloon fell silent, the crowd leaning in despite themselves. This was theater, entertainment, a mountain man about to be humiliated for their amusement. But beneath their expectations, Silas felt something else. Curiosity. Perhaps even hope that someone might humble Kane. Even briefly, his fingers found the dial and began to turn it, slowly, deliberately listening. Every lock told a story. His father had taught him that. The resistance of the pins, the subtle clicks as tumblers aligned, the way metal whispered its secrets if you had the patience to hear them. This safe spoke in his father's language, and Silas had been fluent since childhood. Left, 3 complete rotations to clear any previous attempts, then stop at the first position. The faintest click, a vibration more than a sound, told him he'd found it. 37, right, 2 rotations, then slower. The second number revealed itself through touch and sound. 51, left again. 1 rotation, then easing toward the final number. The crowd shifted restlessly, but Silas remained focused. There. 8. He turned the handle. The safe door swung open. The silence was absolute. Men stared, mouths agape, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. Kane's face went pale, then flushed deep red. His hand tightened on his whiskey glass until Silas thought it might shatter. Inside the safe, stacked neatly, were rows of gold coins and paper currency. But there was also something else, a leather-bound ledger and several sealed envelopes. Silas's eyes scanned the visible page of the ledger, seeing columns of numbers, names, dates. His father had taught him to observe everything, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. Land acquisitions, payments labeled as consultations and negotiations, names he recognized as local ranchers, some with notations like refused or pending, and at the bottom of the visible page, a note in Kane's handwriting, Harrison property, acquire by month's end. Use standard methods if necessary. Silas stood, his expression neutral despite the anger building in his chest. He looked at Kane, then at the crowd. Safes open, he said simply. Kane recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. Well, I'll be damned. Pure luck, of course. Must have left it on the final number by accident. He reached for the ledger, his movements rushed, almost panicked. Silas stepped back, allowing Kane to close the safe and secure the documents. But he'd seen enough. Whatever Kane was doing now, whatever schemes he was running, they followed the same pattern as his betrayal of Thomas Boone. Take what you want. Destroy anyone who opposes you. Hide the evidence behind locked doors. My $10,000, Silas said quietly. Kane's smile was razor-thin. Of course. Though I must say, I'm curious how a mountain trapper learned to crack safes. Perhaps your father taught you more than honest work? The accusation hung in the air. Silas met Kane's gaze steadily. My father taught me that every lock has a story. He taught me patience. He taught me to listen. And he taught me that a man's true character shows in what he chooses to lock away. Kane's expression hardened. Your money will be ready tomorrow. Come to my office. I'll take it now. You've got gold right there in the safe. That gold is earmarked for business expenses. I'll need to arrange a proper withdrawal. Kane's voice carried an edge now, the genial host replaced by something colder. Unless you don't trust me? The question was a trap. Refuse, and Silas would insult Kane publicly, turning this into a confrontation. Accept, and he'd be at Kane's mercy, forced to return when Kane controlled the situation. Silas made his decision. Keep your gold, Mr. Kane, the crowd murmured in surprise. Kane's eyebrows rose. What? I said, keep it. I didn't come here for money. I came because you challenged anyone to open a safe my father designed. I wanted you to know that Thomas Boone's work lives on, and his son learned well. Consider that payment enough. He picked up his pack and turned toward the door. Behind him, Kane's voice rang out, sharp with barely controlled fury. That safe was designed by Philadelphia's finest engineers. Your father had nothing to do with it. Silas paused at the door and looked back. Then why does it have his maker's mark inside the dial mechanism? A small TB scratched into the brass. He put that on every lock he built, thought it was his signature to God's eyes, if no one else's. You'd know that if you'd actually designed it yourself. The crowd erupted in excited conversation. Kane stood frozen, his carefully constructed superiority cracking. Silas had done more than open a safe. He'd publicly called Kane a fraud and thief, using Kane's own arrogance as the weapon. Silas walked out of the Silver Horn into the afternoon sunlight, his heart pounding, but his step steady. Behind him, he could hear Kane shouting for order, trying to regain control of the narrative. But the damage was done. Questions had been planted, doubt had been sown, and Kane, Silas knew with certainty, would not let this pass unanswered. Silas made camp a mile outside Red Bluff, in a grove of cottonwoods near a creek that ran cold and clear from the mountains. He'd chosen the spot deliberately, close enough to return to town if needed, far enough to avoid unwanted attention. The mule grazed contentedly, while Silas built a small fire and set water to boil for coffee. His hands moved through familiar routines, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene in the saloon. Kane's face when the safe opened. The ledger's contents, glimpsed for only a moment but burned into memory. The feel of his father's work beneath his fingertips, the way the mechanism had responded exactly as Thomas had taught him it would. 20 years he'd run from this. 20 years in the high country, trapping and surviving, keeping the past at arm's length. And in 60 seconds it had all come rushing back. The sound of approaching footsteps brought him alert. His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle, leaning against a nearby tree, then relaxed when he recognized Sarah Drummond, picking her way through the underbrush. She carried a basket covered with cloth. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, settling onto a log across from the fire. "Town's buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest. You've made quite an impression. Wasn't my intention. Maybe not, but you've given people something to talk about. First time in years anyone stood up to Kane, even in a small way." She uncovered the basket, revealing fresh bread, cheese, and dried apples. "Eat. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." Silas accepted the food gratefully. Sarah had always been practical in her kindness, never making a fuss, just doing what needed doing. It was one of the things his father had appreciated about her, back when they were neighbors and Thomas was still whole. "I need to tell you something." Sarah said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. About your father and Cain. About what really happened. Silas stopped chewing. I know what happened. Cain stole his designs, ruined his reputation. That's part of it. But there's more. Sarah stared into the fire, gathering her thoughts. Your father and Cain were partners for about 2 years. Thomas handled the technical work, designing locks, safes, security systems for banks and businesses. Cain handled sales, contracts, expansion. It was a good arrangement at first. Thomas got to do what he loved and Cain made sure they got paid for it. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But Cain got greedy, started taking credit for Thomas's innovations in front of clients. Filed patents under his own name. When Thomas confronted him, Cain said it was just business, that investors wanted to deal with one name, not two. Said Thomas should trust him, that they were partners. Silas felt his jaw tighten. It was exactly the kind of slow betrayal that would have devastated his father, who'd believed in honesty and fair dealing above all else. Thomas tried to dissolve the partnership, Sarah continued. Wanted to take his designs and start over on his own. That's when Cain showed his true nature. He'd been careful, you see. Every patent, every contract, every piece of paperwork had only Cain's name on it. Thomas had nothing in writing to prove his contributions. Cain told him if he tried to leave, he'd sue for theft of proprietary information. Said he'd make sure Thomas never worked as a locksmith again. The coffee boiled over, hissing in the fire. Neither of them moved to fix it. Your father fought it the best he could. Went to lawyers, but they wanted money he didn't have. Tried to tell his story to clients, but Cain had already poisoned those wells, told everyone that Thomas was unstable, that he'd been drinking, that he was trying to steal Cain's work. And people believed Cain because Cain had the paperwork, the legitimacy, the respectability. Sarah's voice grew softer. I watched your father break, Silas. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Every door that closed in his face, every former colleague who turned away, every day he couldn't provide for his family. Your mother tried to hold things together, but the shame ate at Thomas. He started drinking because it was the only way he could sleep without thinking about what he'd lost. Silas had been 14 when his mother died, exhausted from taking in washing and mending just to keep food on the table. His father had lasted another 6 months after that, a hollow man going through the motions of living until he couldn't anymore. Silas had found the body in the workshop, his father's tools arranged neatly on the bench, as if Thomas had been preparing for a job he'd never finish. There's something else you should know, Sarah said. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded document, yellowed with age. I found this in your father's things after he died. He'd left it with me for safekeeping, said if anything happened to him, I should hold on to it until the time was right. Silas took the document, unfolding it carefully. It was a partnership agreement, dated 1866, between Thomas Boone and Bartholomew Cain. His father's signature was clear and firm, written in the days when Thomas still had hope. The agreement specified equal ownership, equal say in all decisions, equal division of profits. This proves they were partners, Silas said. It proves more than that. Look at the last page. Silas turned to the final sheet. There, in Cain's own handwriting, was a list of designs and innovations, each one attributed to Thomas Boone. A ledger of genius, documenting everything his father had created. And at the bottom, Cain's signature as witness to Thomas's contributions. Cain signed this knowing full well what Thomas had invented. He documented it himself, probably for tax purposes or partnership records. Then he buried it and pretended none of it existed. Silas stared at the document, feeling 20 years of grief and anger crystallize into something focused and purposeful. This wasn't just proof of partnership. It was proof of theft, of fraud, of deliberate malice. Why didn't you show this to anyone? He asked. I wanted to. But who would I show it to? Cain owned the law in Red Bluff, owned the judges, owned everyone who mattered. This document would have disappeared, and I might have disappeared with it. So I kept it safe, kept it hidden, waited for the right moment. And now? Sarah met his gaze. Now you're here. Thomas's son, with his father's skill and his father's knowledge. You opened that safe today, Silas. You proved Thomas's work lives on. People saw it, and they're starting to ask questions. Maybe this time, the truth has a chance. Footsteps approached from the direction of town. Both Silas and Sarah turned to see Deputy Marshal Jim Hadley emerging from the shadows, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that was more habit than threat. "Evening, folks," Hadley said. He was a lean man in his 40s, with a weathered face that suggested he'd seen more than his share of trouble. "Mind if I join you?" "Depends on why you're here," Silas replied. "Fair question." Hadley sat down uninvited, his movements suggesting exhaustion more than hostility. "I'm here because Kane's already making noise about pressing charges. Says you must have cheated somehow, maybe had an inside man tell you the combination. Says he wants you investigated for theft and fraud. I didn't steal anything. I know. I was there. I saw what you did." Hadley pulled out a pipe and tobacco pouch, began packing it methodically. "Problem is, Kane pays my salary. Pays for the courthouse, the jail, most of the civic infrastructure in this town. When he says jump, most folks ask how high." "And you?" Sarah asked. Hadley lit his pipe, the tobacco glowing red in the darkness. "I've been a lawman for 23 years, seen a lot of men like Kane, powerful, ruthless, convinced they're above consequences. Usually they are, until they're not." He looked at Silas. "Your father was a good man. I knew him a little, back before things went bad. What Kane did to him was wrong. Everyone knew it, but nobody had the courage to say it." "So what happens now?" Silas asked. "Now you make a choice. You can take that partnership agreement, get on your mule, and ride to the territorial capital. File a lawsuit. Try to reclaim what your father was owed. It'll take years, cost money you don't have, and Kane will fight you every step of the way. But it's legal, and it's safe. Or," Hadley drew on his pipe, "or you stay. You keep digging into Kane's business, keep asking questions, keep making him nervous. He's got secrets, that much I know. That ledger you saw? That's just the tip of the mountain. Kane's into things that would shock decent folks. And if someone was brave enough to expose it, this whole town might finally see him for what he is." "You're asking him to risk his life," Sarah said sharply. "I'm telling him the situation." Hadley stood, knocking ash from his pipe. "Kane's already sent word to his enforcers. 3 men rode in this evening from Silver City. They're not nice fellas, Silas. They're the kind Kane uses when he wants problems to disappear permanently. My advice, be very careful where you sleep tonight." With that, the deputy marshal walked back toward town, leaving Silas and Sarah alone with the fire and the weight of difficult choices. "You should go," Sarah said quietly. "Take the document and go. Your father wouldn't want you to die for this." Silas looked at the partnership agreement in his hands, then at the fire. In the flames, he could almost see his father's face. Not as it had been at the end, broken and defeated, but as it was in Silas's earliest memories, strong and sure, teaching his son about patience and precision and the dignity of honest work. "My father spent his last years wishing he'd fought harder," Silas said. "I won't spend mine wishing the same thing." Morning came with frost on the ground and mist rising from the creek. Silas had slept lightly, his rifle within reach, waking at every sound. The night had passed without incident, but he knew that was temporary grace. Kane's men were coming. It was only a question of when. He broke camp methodically, packing his gear with the efficiency of a man who'd lived rough for decades. But instead of heading back into the mountains as every instinct urged, he saddled his mule and rode toward Red Bluff. If he was going to stay and fight, he needed to understand what he was fighting against. The town was already awake, businesses opening their doors to the morning trade. Silas tied his mule outside Drummond's Mercantile and entered to find Sarah brewing coffee behind the counter. "Thought you might have left," she said, though her tone suggested relief rather than disappointment. "Not yet." He accepted the cup she offered. "I need information. You said that ledger showed Kane's current schemes. What do you know about them?" Sarah glanced toward the door, ensuring they were alone. "Kane's been buying up ranch land south of town. Says he needs it for railroad expansion, but the prices he's offering are insults. Most ranchers can't afford to refuse. They're barely scraping by as it is. The ones who do refuse tend to have unfortunate accidents. Barn fires, cattle rustling. One man, Jacob Harrison, stood his ground for months, then his water source got poisoned, lost half his herd before he finally sold. And nobody stops him? Who would? The territorial marshal comes through maybe twice a year. Local law answers to Kane, and most folks are either too scared or too dependent on railroad money to speak up. She set down her own cup, her expression grim. Kane's building something bigger than just a railroad, Silas. He wants to control everything. The land, the water rights, the supply routes. Anyone who doesn't bend to his will gets broken. The door chimed, and young Daniel from the previous day entered, his face flushed with excitement. "Miss Sarah, my pa says Kane's men are looking for the mountain man. Says there's trouble brewing." "Where's your father now?" Sarah asked. "At the ranch. Sent me to warn you in case Mr. Boone came by." Daniel looked at Silas with a mixture of awe and concern. "You really opened Kane's safe? My pa says you made him look like a fool." "Your father's name Harrison?" Silas asked. "Yes, sir. Jacob Harrison. We got the ranch about 8 miles south, or what's left of it anyway." Silas felt the pieces clicking together, the Harrison property mentioned in Kane's ledger, the family that had resisted and suffered for it. Here was a boy who'd watched his father's livelihood destroyed by the same man who'd destroyed Thomas Boone. "Your father still on the ranch?" Silas asked. "Yes, sir. Though Kane's been pressuring him again, says the railroad needs to run right through our land now, not around it. Offered PR less money than before, said take it or face condemnation proceedings." Sarah's jaw tightened. "That land's been in your family 30 years, Daniel. Your grandfather homesteaded it." "Pa knows, but he's tired, Miss Sarah. Tired of fighting. Says maybe it's time to just take what we can get and move on." Silas saw defeat in the boy's eyes, the same kind of resignation he'd seen in his mother's face all those years ago. The acceptance that some fights couldn't be won, that powerful men always got their way in the end. "Tell your father I'd like to visit," Silas said, "if he's willing to talk." Daniel brightened slightly. "I'll tell him. He admires what you did yesterday, even if it scared him some." After the boy left, Sarah turned to Silas. "You're thinking of helping them. I'm thinking Kane's pattern hasn't changed. He destroys people who stand in his way, takes what he wants, and counts on everyone being too afraid to fight back." Silas pulled out the partnership agreement from his pack. "This document proves Kane's a thief, but it's 20 years old. By itself it won't stop what he's doing now. So what will? Evidence. Fresh evidence of his current crimes. That ledger in his safe had names, dates, payments. If I could get my hands on his records, prove he's been using illegal methods to acquire land, maybe even prove he's committed murder, that might be enough to bring in real law enforcement." Sarah's eyes widened. "You're talking about breaking into Kane's office. I'm talking about getting justice for people who can't get it themselves." Silas met her gaze steadily. "My father couldn't fight back. He didn't have the strength or the resources. But these ranchers, they're fighting right now, even if they're losing. Maybe I can tip the balance, or maybe Kane's men will kill you before you get close. That's a risk I'm willing to take." "Why?" Sarah's voice rose with frustration. "Why? Risk everything for people you don't even know?" Silas was quiet for a moment, considering. "Because someone should have done it for my father. Should have stood up and said what Kane was doing was wrong. Should have helped him fight instead of just watching him fall apart. I can't go back and save Thomas Boone. But maybe I can save Jacob Harrison and his son from the same fate." Sarah studied him, then nodded slowly. "Your father would be proud of you. Not for the safe cracking, but for this. For standing up. He'd probably tell me I'm a fool. He'd be right about that too." She managed a small smile. "But sometimes being a fool is the bravest thing a man can do." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, Silas saw 3 riders entering town. They moved with the swagger of men used to being feared, hands resting casually on their gun belts. The lead rider was tall and lean, with cold eyes that swept the street like a predator searching for prey. "That's Clayton Reeves," Sarah whispered. "Kane's head enforcer. The other two are his brothers, Virgil and Amos. They're the ones Deputy Hadley warned you about." Silas watched as the Reeves brothers dismounted in front of Kane's office. They weren't here to talk. They were here to send a message. "I need to see Harrison," Silas said. "Today, before Kane's men make their next move. I'll arrange it." "But Silas," Sarah gripped his arm. "Be careful. These aren't men who give warnings." "Neither am I," Silas replied, though the weight of what he was committing to settled heavily on his shoulders. He'd spent 20 years avoiding conflict, running from pain, hiding in the mountains where the past couldn't reach him. Now he was walking straight into the fire, and there was no guarantee he'd come out the other side. But his father's voice echoed in his memory, teaching him about locks and patience and the importance of listening. Some things, Thomas had said, were worth the effort to open, worth the time to understand, worth the risk to protect. Silas was beginning to understand what his father had meant. The Harrison ranch sat in a shallow valley where the grassland met the foothills. It had been a prosperous spread once. Silas could see that in the sturdy barn and the well-maintained fences that still stood in places. But years of hardship showed in the unpainted wood, the patched roof, and the depleted pastures where too few cattle grazed. Jacob Harrison met him at the door, a man in his 50s who looked 20 years older. His face was lined with worry and exhaustion, his hands scarred from decades of hard work. But his handshake was firm, and his eyes held a spark of stubborn pride that Kane hadn't managed to extinguish. "Daniel said you wanted to talk," Harrison said, leading Silas into a modest house that smelled of wood smoke and coffee. "Not sure what I can tell you that'll help, but you're welcome here. Any man who can take Kane down a peg deserves hospitality." They sat at a worn kitchen table, where Harrison's wife Mary served coffee and biscuits. She was a quiet woman with kind eyes that had seen too much hardship. Daniel hovered nearby, eager to hear what would be said. "I need to understand Kane's methods," Silas began. "How he operates, who he works with, how he gets people to sell when they don't want to." Harrison sighed, stirring his coffee absently. "Started about 3 years ago. Kane sent a man around, nice fellow, offering generous prices for land south of town. Said the railroad needed to expand, that it was good for everyone. Some folks sold right away, saw it as a windfall. But a few of us knew the land was worth more than Kane was offering. We said no. What happened then? Things got difficult." Harrison's jaw tightened. "Small things at first. Supplies from town would be delayed or cost more than they should. Workers I'd hired would suddenly find other jobs. Then bigger problems started. Fences cut. Cattle wandering onto Kane's land, and when I'd go to fetch them, his men would claim I was trespassing." Mary spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. "They killed our dog. Said it was attacking their livestock, but Buck had never shown aggression in his life. That's when we knew it wasn't about business anymore. It was about breaking us." "The water," Daniel added, his young voice tight with anger. "Tell him about the water." Harrison's face darkened. "We get our water from Copper Creek. It runs through Kane's land upstream before it reaches us. Last spring, the water started running foul. Lost 30 head of cattle before we figured out someone had dumped something upstream. Never could prove it was Kane's doing, but the timing was convenient. Came right after I told his man to stop coming around." Silas felt the familiar pattern emerging. Systematic pressure, plausible deniability, escalating consequences until the target broke. You could have reported it to the territorial marshal. Did. Marshal came through about 2 months after it happened. By then, the creek was clean again, and Kane's lawyers had paperwork showing they'd been conducting legitimate mining operations that might have caused temporary contamination. "Accident," they said. Marshall told me I'd have to prove deliberate poisoning, which I couldn't do. "Case closed. So you're selling?" Harrison looked down at his hands. "Don't see much choice. My wife's exhausted. My son deserves better than watching everything we've built get destroyed piece by piece. Kane's latest offer is barely enough to start over somewhere else, but it's more than we'll have if we keep fighting." Pa, Daniel protested, but Harrison raised a hand. I know, son. But there's a difference between courage and foolishness. We've lost this fight. Silas thought about his father, about the moment when Thomas Boone had realized the same thing. The moment when fighting back seemed impossible and surrender seemed inevitable. What if there was another way? Silas asked. Harrison looked up, hope and skepticism warring in his expression. What kind of way? Kane keeps records. He has to. A man doesn't run an operation this size without documentation. Bank transfers, land deeds, communications with his enforcers. If someone could get access to those records, prove he's been using illegal methods, the territorial government would have to act. They'd void his land acquisitions. Maybe even press criminal charges. You're talking about breaking into Kane's office. I'm talking about gathering evidence of crimes already committed. Harrison shook his head. You'd never get near it. Kane's got guards, and after what you did yesterday, he'll be watching for you specifically. It's suicide. Maybe, but I have advantages Kane doesn't know about. I understand how he thinks, how men like him operate. And I'm very good with locks. Silas leaned forward. I need to know everything you can tell me about Kane's business office. Lay out guards when he's there, when he's not. Any detail might matter. Mary and Daniel exchanged glances. Harrison studied Silas for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression, a hardening of resolve that had been absent before. The office is above the Silverhorn Saloon, Harrison said. Kane's there most mornings and late evenings, doing business and entertaining associates. Afternoons, he's usually at the railroad yard or visiting his various properties. He's got 2 guards during the day, sometimes more at night. Back entrance. Fire escape on the north side leads to a landing outside Kane's private quarters. Door's always locked, but it's quieter than going through the saloon. They spent the next hour going over details. The layout of the building, the habits of the guards, the best times for an attempt. Harrison even sketched a rough map on a piece of paper, his farmer's hands surprisingly deft at the drawing. There's something else you should know, Harrison said as their meeting concluded. Kane's planning something big. My neighbor Tom Welch overheard some railroad men talking last week. They were surveying land all the way to the territorial border. Kane's not just building a railroad. He's trying to monopolize the entire southern corridor. Once he controls that, he'll control all commerce in and out of the territory. Silas absorbed this information, feeling the scale of Kane's ambition. This wasn't just about revenge for Thomas Boone anymore, or even about saving the Harrisons. This was about stopping a man who would consume everything in his path if left unchecked. One more question, Silas said. Do you trust Deputy Hadley? Harrison considered. As much as any man can trust a lawman on Kane's payroll. Jim's not a bad sort. I think he tries to do right when he can. But he's got a family to feed and Kane signs his paychecks. Don't expect him to stick his neck out too far. As Silas prepared to leave, Daniel caught his arm. Mr. Boone, are you really going to do this? Go after Kane. Silas looked at the boy, seeing echoes of himself at that age, young, angry, desperate for someone to make things right. I'm going to try, Silas said honestly. Can't promise how it'll turn out, but I'm going to try. My grandfather used to say that trying's all any man can do, Daniel replied. The rest is up to God and luck. Your grandfather was a wise man. Riding back toward town, Silas felt the weight of what he'd committed to. He wasn't just fighting for his father's memory anymore. He was fighting for the Harrisons, for the other ranchers Kane had crushed or would crush, for the idea that powerful men shouldn't be allowed to destroy lives without consequence. The sun was setting as he approached Red Bluff, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere in that town was the evidence he needed, and somewhere in that town were men who'd been ordered to kill him. Tomorrow, he'd begin planning in earnest. Tonight, he needed to survive. As if summoned by his thoughts, 3 riders appeared on the road ahead, blocking his path. The Reeves brothers. Clayton in the center, his brothers flanking him like wolves waiting for the signal to attack. Silas reined in his mule, keeping his hands visible and away from his rifle. This was the moment he'd been expecting, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. Evening, Clayton Reeves said, his voice casual, but his eyes cold. You and I need to have a conversation about your future in Red Bluff. Clayton Reeves had the look of a man who'd been dangerous his whole life. Not the loud, blustering danger of a barroom brawler, but the quiet, calculated danger of someone who killed efficiently and without regret. His brothers, Virgil and Amos, were cut from similar cloth, hard men with dead eyes. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," Silas said, keeping his voice steady. "Clayton Reeves, these are my brothers, and you're the mountain man who's been causing Mr. Kane some distress." Clayton shifted in his saddle, his hand resting near his pistol. "Now, Mr. Kane is a reasonable man. He understands you might have had personal reasons for that little display yesterday, but he's also a businessman, and he can't have people thinking he's weak or that his word doesn't count. His word wasn't involved. He made a wager and I won, except you didn't collect your winnings, which makes people wonder what you were really after." Clayton's smile was thin and humorless. "Mr. Kane would like to settle this matter quietly. He's prepared to offer you $500, generous money for a trapper, if you leave town today and don't come back. $500. A fraction of what Kane had wagered, but still more money than most men saw in a year. It was the kind of offer that came with an unspoken threat. Take it or face the alternative. "And if I decline?" Silas asked. "Then we'd have to discuss your trespassing on Kane property, your possible theft of trade secrets, and various other legal complications that could arise. Mr. Kane has lawyers, Mr. Boone, very good lawyers. They could make your life extremely difficult. He already made my life difficult 20 years ago when he destroyed my father." Clayton's expression didn't change, but Silas saw recognition flicker in his eyes. "That's old business. Ancient history. No court would even hear a complaint that old. Then why is Kane worried?" "He's not worried. He's being prudent." Clayton leaned forward slightly. "Listen to me carefully. I've been doing this work for 10 years. I've seen men like you before, men with grievances, men who think they can get justice where there is none. They all end the same way, dead, broken, or disappeared. The smart ones take the money and move on." Virgil spoke up from the left. "We could just handle this now, Clay. Save everyone the trouble." "Shut up, Virgil." Clayton never took his eyes off Silas. "I don't like unnecessary violence. It's messy and it draws attention. But I'll do what needs doing if you force my hand. So here's how this works. You've got until tomorrow noon to make your decision. Take the money and leave, or stay and deal with the consequences. There won't be a third offer." Silas considered his options. He could try to fight. 3 against 1 were bad odds, but he'd faced worse in the mountains. He could run, disappear back into the high country where men like the Reeves brothers wouldn't follow. Or he could call their bluff, see how far Kane was willing to push this. "I'll think about it," Silas said finally. "You do that." Clayton gathered his reins. "One more thing. Stay away from the Harrison family. They're in negotiations with Mr. Kane, and outside interference isn't welcome. We'd hate for anything unfortunate to happen to them because of your meddling." The threat was clear. Touch the Harrisons, and Kane would hurt them. It was the same tactic he'd used on Thomas Boone, threaten the people they cared about until they backed down. The Reeves brothers rode off, leaving Silas alone on the darkening road. His hands were shaking slightly, and he realized it wasn't from fear, but from anger. The casual cruelty of it, the assumption that everyone had a price or a breaking point. Kane had learned nothing from destroying Thomas Boone. He'd just refined his methods. By the time Silas reached his camp, full darkness had fallen. He built no fire, instead sitting in the shadows with his rifle across his lap, thinking through everything he'd learned. Kane's office layout, the guards' routines, the evidence that must exist somewhere in those files. But more than that, he thought about his father, about the nights Thomas had sat in their workshop, staring at his tools, too broken to use them. About the moment Silas had found him dead and understood that some men could be killed without anyone ever raising a hand against them. "I'm sorry, Pa," Silas whispered to the darkness. "Sorry I wasn't strong enough to help you back then. Sorry I ran away instead of fighting." A sound brought him alert, footsteps approaching through the cottonwoods. His finger found the rifle's trigger, then relaxed when Deputy Hadley's voice called out softly, "Don't shoot. It's Jim Hadley. You make a habit of sneaking up on armed men. Only when I need to talk without being seen." Hadley moved into the camp, careful to stay visible. "Reeves brothers just reported to Kane, said they gave you the offer and you're thinking about it. Word travels fast. This is a small town, and Kane pays people to tell him things." Hadley sat on a log, his exhaustion evident. "I probably shouldn't be here, but I figured you deserved a warning. Kane's not bluffing about the Harrisons. If you keep pushing, he'll hurt them to get to you, so I should just leave. Let him keep destroying people?" "I'm not saying that. I'm saying be smart about how you fight." Hadley pulled out a folded paper from his pocket. "This is a list of dates when Kane's office will be empty. He's got a meeting with railroad investors in Silver City 3 days from now. Takes his guards with him, leaves the place locked up. If someone were planning something foolish, that'd be the time." Silas took the paper, studied it in the dim light. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I'm tired of watching good people get crushed. Because I've got a daughter about Daniel Harrison's age, and I don't want her growing up in a world where men like Kane always win." Hadley stood, preparing to leave. "I can't do much. I've got a family to protect and a job to keep. But I can give you this much. It might be enough, or it might get you killed. Just remember, Kane's survived this long because he's smart and ruthless. Don't underestimate him." After Hadley left, Silas studied the schedule. 3 days, 72 hours to prepare, to plan, to steel himself for what he was about to do. He pulled out his father's old locksmith tools, running his fingers over the worn brass. Thomas had taught him that opening locks was about patience and listening, about understanding the mechanism and respecting the craft. But Thomas had also taught him something else, though perhaps he'd never meant to. He taught Silas that sometimes the most important things in life were worth fighting for, even when fighting seemed impossible. Worth standing for, even when standing alone. Worth dying for, if necessary, because living without honor or purpose was a slower, more painful death. Silas packed the tools carefully, then checked his rifle. 3 days to get ready. After that, he'd either have the evidence to destroy Kane, or Kane would have one more body to dispose of. Either way, the running was over. The night Kane left for Silver City, Silas moved through Red Bluff like a ghost. Most of the town was asleep, save for the saloons and the night guards making their rounds. He'd spent 3 days watching, learning patterns, noting details. Now it was time to act. The fire escape Clayton Reeves had mentioned was exactly where Harrison had described it. A metal stairway clinging to the north side of the building, leading to a second-floor landing. Silas climbed slowly, testing each step for noise. The door at the top was locked, as expected, but it was a simple mechanism compared to the safes his father had built. 2 minutes with his picks, and the lock yielded. Silas eased the door open, listening for any sound of occupation. Nothing. The office was dark and empty. Inside, he lit a small, shielded lantern that would give him light without being visible from the street. Kane's office was exactly what he'd expected. Heavy furniture, expensive carpets, walls lined with maps, and surveys showing the railroad's expansion. A large desk dominated the room, its surface cluttered with papers and correspondence. But it was the safe in the corner that drew Silas's attention. Not the display safe from the saloon, but a much older model, battered and worn. And on closer inspection, unmistakably his father's work. Not just influenced by Thomas Boone's designs, but actually built by his hands. Silas could see the telltale markers, the precision of the hinges, the specific pattern of the reinforcement, the tiny TB marks scratched into the metal near the base. For a moment, emotion threatened to overwhelm him. This safe had been built by his father, probably during the partnership with Kane. It had been one of the last things Thomas made before everything fell apart. Silas pressed his ear against the cold metal and began to work. The combination was different from the public safe, but the mechanism spoke to him in his father's language. Left, right, left again. The tumblers fell into place, as if welcoming a familiar friend. The door swung open. Inside was exactly what Silas had hoped to find: ledgers, contracts, correspondence spanning years. He pulled them out quickly, photographing pages with the small camera Sarah had lent him, a modern marvel from back east. Each click captured evidence of Kane's crimes: forged documents, bribed officials, detailed plans for intimidation and violence. But as he worked through the files, something caught his attention. A leather folder separate from the rest, marked with his father's name. Thomas Boone. Private Silas opened it with trembling hands. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Letters from Kane to Thomas, dating back to the early days of their partnership. The first few were friendly, professional, discussing business and designs. But as Silas read through them chronologically, a darker story emerged. Kane hadn't just stolen Thomas's designs out of greed. He'd planned it from the beginning. Letter after letter showed careful manipulation, praising Thomas while subtly undermining his confidence, isolating him from other business contacts, slowly assuming control of every aspect of their partnership. It was a masterwork of psychological destruction, documented in Kane's own hand. But the most devastating document was near the bottom of the folder. A letter from Thomas to Kane, dated 6 months before Thomas's death. Bartholomew, it read in his father's careful script, "I know what you've done. I know about the forged patents, the false testimony, the bribes. I've kept records of everything, copies of our original agreements, proof that these designs were mine. I'm writing this to give you one last chance to make things right. Acknowledge my contributions, restore my name, and give my family what we're owed. If you refuse, I'll take everything I have to the territorial court. No matter the cost, your former partner, Thomas Boone." Beneath it was Kane's reply, a single paragraph of cold calculation. "Thomas, you'll do no such thing. I've reviewed your evidence and find it laughable. Any copies you have are meaningless without the originals, which are safely in my possession. As for testimony, who will believe a drunk against a successful businessman? Your threats are empty, your position is hopeless, and your only wise course is to accept your defeat with what dignity you have left. Continue this foolishness, and I'll ensure you never work again anywhere in the territory. I'll see you destitute, broken, and forgotten." V. Kane. Silas felt his hands shaking as he read his father's response to that letter, dated 2 weeks before his death. "Kane, you win. I don't have the strength to fight anymore. I'm writing this to say I'm done. Keep your empire built on lies. Keep the money you stole. Keep everything. I just have one request: leave my son alone. He's young, he's innocent, and he deserves a chance at life without your shadow over him. That's all I ask. Let him be." Thomas, below that, Kane had written a single line: "Agreed. The boy is of no concern to me." Silas stared at those words, feeling 20 years of grief and anger crystallize into something else. His father hadn't just given up. He'd made a deal. He'd surrendered everything, accepting defeat, accepting humiliation, accepting his own destruction, all to protect his son. And Silas had never known. He'd spent 2 decades thinking his father was weak, that Thomas had broken because he couldn't handle the pressure. But the truth was, Thomas had been strong enough to sacrifice everything, including his own life, to keep his son safe from Kane's reach. The tears came then, silent and bitter. All those years of resentment, of shame, of wondering why his father hadn't fought harder. And Thomas had been fighting the whole time, just not in the way Silas had understood. A sound from downstairs brought Silas back to the present. Voices, multiple people entering the building. Kane was supposed to be in Silver City. The schedule Hadley had given him said understanding hit like a physical blow. It was a trap. Silas moved quickly, stuffing documents into his pack. But before he could close the safe, he saw one more item. A small wooden box in the back. He grabbed it instinctively and was turning toward the door when it burst open. Clayton Reeves stood in the doorway, pistol drawn, a cold smile on his face. Behind him, more men appeared, blocking any escape. "Mr. Kane thought you might try something like this," Clayton said. "He's gotten very good at predicting how desperate men think." That schedule you got from Deputy Hadley? Kane fed it to him, knowing he'd pass it along to you. We'd been waiting downstairs the whole time, just listening to you incriminate yourself. Silas's mind raced. The fire escape was blocked. The main door was blocked. He was trapped. Hand over the documents, Clayton continued. And we might let you leave town alive. Might. Silas looked at the papers in his pack, evidence of Kane's crimes, proof of his father's sacrifice. If he gave them up now, everything Thomas had endured would be for nothing. No, Silas said. Clayton sighed. Virgil Amos, take him. The brothers moved forward. Silas grabbed the lantern and hurled it at them, oil splashing, flames spreading. In the chaos, he dove toward the window, the one that overlooked the street rather than the fire escape. Glass shattered as he crashed through, falling 2 stories into the night. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his shoulder, but rolled and came up running. Behind him, shouts and gunfire erupted. He ran through Red Bluff's back alleys, the documents and mysterious box still in his pack, blood on his clothes and fire spreading in Kane's office. He'd failed to be careful, failed to avoid the trap. But he'd gotten what he came for and more, the truth about his father's final days. Now he just had to survive long enough to use it. Behind him, the night exploded with alarm bells and running men. Kane's entire organization was mobilizing, hunting for the mountain man who dared to steal from the untouchable railroad tycoon. Silas ran toward the only place he might find safety, Sarah's store. It was dangerous, might bring trouble down on her, but he had no other options. As he pounded on the back door, hearing pursuit getting closer, one thought consumed him. His father had died protecting him. Silas would be damned if he'd let that sacrifice be wasted. The door opened, and Sarah pulled him inside, her face pale with fear. "Dear God, Silas, what did you do?" "Got the truth," he gasped. "All of it." But Kane knew I was coming. The fire. Accident. Is there a place to hide? Sarah didn't hesitate. She led him through a trapdoor into a root cellar beneath the store, a space barely large enough for a man to crouch. "Stay here. Don't make a sound." As the trapdoor closed above him, plunging Silas into darkness, he clutched the documents and the mysterious box to his chest. Outside, he could hear shouts, running feet, the organized chaos of a manhunt. He'd opened Kane's safe and found more than evidence. He'd found the truth about his father, about sacrifice, about the lengths a parent would go to protect a child. Now he just had to live long enough to make that truth matter.